Good afternoon and thank you for joining us. In preparation for Inclusion Week, I was reflecting the other day on the actual word inclusion and what it means, and the fact that here in Bradford it's very much part of our core foundation for everything we do now and of course in the future. I know this week has included some really interesting elements of future inclusion, but I've chosen to focus on some of our LGBTQ past, and undoubtedly our history is reflected in both our current and our future. Today, the changes in perception, understanding and inclusion for and of the gay community is often said to be getting better. Well, that might be true for some people in some parts of the world, but certainly still not for everybody. We've seen many watershed events over our history: Stonewall in the late 1960s, the development of the gay rights movement in the 1970s, and of course the horrendous spectre of AIDS in the 1980s. In some states of the USA and in the entire UK, the age of sexual consent for gay men achieved some equality with the heterosexual majority. As we moved into the new millennium, same-sex couples in several countries around the world were afforded the opportunity to marry. You could argue the future looks promising for some people, depending on where you live in the world. But what of our gay forefathers and foremothers? Of those women and men who've had to endure a life far from being liberal? They didn't have the recognition, the freedom, or indeed the chance to be themselves. So I want to transport us back in time with our guest speaker this afternoon, Narvel Annable. Narvel's an author, campaigner, and a champion of the LGBTQ+ community. But it's not always been like that.
Hello readers. A Derby Telegraph feature neatly summed up my life, which has been, quite frankly, something of a car crash. The reporter said that Narvel's campaigns are his books and his campaigns are his way of handling the guilt he feels for keeping quiet for so long about his homosexuality. He said that writing has helped him through a lot of emotions. In 1957, 63 years ago, at the age of 12, I attended Monday Street Boys' School in Derbyshire, a colliery town. It was a culture of cruelty. A boy was esteemed by his ability to inflict humiliation and pain and suffering on other boys. Well, I was, for example, I was too frightened to use the school toilet. Yeah. Horrible incidents made the lavatory a no-go area for a man who grew up to be permanently constipated. It's as bad as that. Well, word went round the playground: "Annables on bog!" and a crowd gathered to enjoy the sport. Alarmingly, several times unknown assailants kicked the door, causing panic. Violent kicks, loud bangs, terrifying bangs within that small cubicle. Distressing bumps and thumps reverberated. There was no escape. On several occasions I arrived home, unfortunately having messed my trousers. My mother, unsympathetic, well, she couldn't cope. She shook her head. I can see her now. "Oh, not again." She said, "You make work for me." Well, I planned an act of self-destruction because I was so miserable being continually at the mercy of powerful pupils. There were 48 boys in that class, and most of the time the teacher wasn't there. The schoolmaster was sadistic. He enjoyed causing pain. He targeted me because I was different from the other boys. Classroom situations were arranged in which I suffered excruciating humiliations. They caused emotional damage which will follow me to the grave. To this day, I endure flashbacks, intrusive thoughts causing distress which still disturb my sleep. If not branded into my flesh with a hot iron, the traumas inflicted by that ruthless Church of England regime are burnt into my mind. Cruelty has a cost. Now in my mid-70s, I'm actually 75. I'm still paying the bill. My day started with hymns and prayers and ended with the desire to be dead. I'd got nowhere to go. My unfeeling parents took the view that I deserved unhappiness and pain and all the criticism. I brought it down on my own head. According to them, it was my fault. Well, you see, male Annabals were fighters giving a good account of themselves in the school playground with bare knuckles. I dishonoured the family. That's about the size of it. 10 years on, I can remember my dad saying, he summed it up, he said, I canna kick a ball, I canna knock back a pint, because I don't drink, and worse, much worse, I canna fancy a lass. For most of my life I hid in fear of being exposed, embarrassed and humiliated. Born into a macho, football-crazy, beer-swilling, working-class, coal-mining culture, homophobia, a hatred of LGBT people, well, it was a badge of honour with some of them, some youths. A thief, a thug, or a murderer would be afforded more respect than a gentle, honest, gay man. After suffering painful incidents, I learned to exist in isolation and stay deeply hidden inside of myself. Well, one day a school bully shoved his fist into my face and he said, I'm taking you to see my granddad. Well, the old man lived in near the school in a derelict house. It was covered in ivy. You wouldn't have thought anyone lived in there. But we became friends, me and this old man, and I was comforted by his gentle demeanour and his willingness to hear of my anxieties and acute unhappiness. Grandad was the only person to show kindness and offer practical help during that period of 1957. He heard about my plan to kill myself, and he was horrified. He was absolutely horrified. I can hear him now. He said, Nay, lad, I won't do that. Life's precious. Dead lad can do nought. Live lad, he can do summat. Well, you know, I often think about that now and what I'm doing now and talking to you and telling my story. Well, they always said, hit them back. Well, I'm fighting now. Not with bare knuckles, but with pen and keyboard. But I couldn't fight then. I was the only boy who didn't like football. In working class coal mining Derbyshire, it was unheard of for a lad like me to not like football. Unacceptable. Sissy, Mardy, queer. Years later, suffering a mental breakdown, I went to see a professional counsellor, and he interviewed me for an assessment, and he focused on the cruelty I experienced at the age of 12. After several sessions, he diagnosed PTSD, that is post-traumatic stress disorder, equating me with emotionally damaged soldiers who've heard terrible things, seen terrible, excruciating experiences in the field of battle. Well, I was surprised, but the counsellor, he explained. He said, you know, you shouldn't be surprised. He said, on a daily basis, in late 1957, he says, you describe physical attacks such as a thump in your tummy, that's called winding, and then there was a sharp kick in the leg, that's called deadlegging. It's enough to bring you down quickly. Well, and occasionally, the counsellor said, he said, occasionally you've described a boy coming up behind you and screaming as loud as he could in your ear. That resulted in a lifelong loss of hearing. I still have a hearing problem to this day. And all this in front of a mob of jeering bullies, whipped up by a teacher who was supposed to protect you. So, he said, you are a victim of torture, as terrible for a 12-year-old as it would be for a man in uniform. The agonizing memories, the vivid flashbacks, and intrusive thoughts causing rage, these are the symptoms of PTSD. Well, academically, I couldn't spell, couldn't do sums, and I sank into the bottom of the class in most subjects. I displayed no practical ability. You know, rough Hena lads are supposed to make things. Well, I made nothing. Tortured children do tend to do badly in school, and I do mean tortured. The Narvel of 1957 was broken, scarred, and he'll take his injuries to the grave. One of the most feared toughs in that school was a big lad called Blubber. Now, he was an occasional visitor to the old coal miner I used to visit, the old guy around the corner. And I suspect, I'm not absolutely certain of this, but I suspect he told Blubber to look after me, to use his network of terror to subdue the mob. Well, Blubber was a powerful pupil. He always sat at the back of the class, in that Dickensian classroom. You've got to remember, it's an old school. As ever, cock of the classroom, he was keeping a close eye on all 48 ragamuffins. A few years later, he became the most feared fighter in Hena. I remember one significant incident. Eerie silence inside the classroom. Outside, thick fog and failing light. Inside, the schoolmaster reached up to pull the chain of the gas light. No electricity in the school. Pull the gas light to produce an extra glow on this bleak geography lesson. We'd all got our atlases out. 20 years old, these atlases. They were tattered and ink splattered. So obviously they were used in the 1930s, if you think about it. Soft incandescence of gas mantles, shining a weak light, helped me to explore my map of India. I was soothed by the gentle hiss of the lights and the warm, friendly, crackling fire, open fire, banked up by the coal monitor. This was a lad called Chunky. He was deformed with rickets. It's typical bad feeding and all Anyway, he was as dirty as the coal. He used to bank it up. On that cold midwinter afternoon, I was unaware of an invisible protection from a new guardian angel. Now this was Blubber sitting directly behind me, big butch Blubber. And I remember the schoolmaster asking a question. "What is the capital of India?" Silence. Not a single hand went up. No one in that class knew. I knew. Oh yes. But not surprisingly, I was afraid to answer. I'd never answered a question before, at all. But I like maps, you know, and often was intrigued by the big city prominently inscribed on the map on the west coast of the Indian subcontinent, Bombay. Bombay was certainly the capital of India, I had no doubt. "Stupid lot," barked the schoolmaster. "I suppose I'll have to tell you." Well, hesitantly, very slowly, my hand went up. Many in that class were surprised, nobody more surprised than me. "Sir, Bombay, sir." "Bombay? You idiot, Bombay indeed. What a stupid answer, you stupid lad." There were some smiles and a ripple of laughter after that, which quickly subsided. Normally, after such an incident like that, there would be much more laughter. Any opportunity to hit the hog. I should explain here that I call myself in my books Simian Hog, because my nickname for some reason was Piggy. I wasn't fat, but they called me that. So I call myself Simian Hog. Simian, S-I-M-E-O-N, Sim-me-on, Simian Hog. So anyway, there was a ripple of laughter, but not a lot. Any opportunity to hit the hog was an enjoyable part of the classroom routine. It happened every day. Jeers, hoots, catcalls, any amount of cruel mockery. Piggy was my nickname. I just told you that. That's why I call myself Simian Hog in the book. Now, I watched the master carefully, and his face said it all. Oh, there was some confusion melting into, well, yes, I suspected it was fear. All the teachers feared Blubber. Make no mistake about that. After a few seconds, a deadly silence descended, into which the master, unable to cope, he had to reassert his authority. So he said, "The capital of India is a city called Delhi." Delhi! For me, there was a small improvement in the January of 1958 after Blubber started to look after me. Well, let's move on a bit. Years later, in the 1960s, as an adult, I went to Derby Cathedral and I fell in conversation with a canon there. And he knew I was gay and I knew he was gay, and he was giving me some advice. He said, "You'd be very careful, Narvel, very careful indeed." He said, "You know, once your name is in the paper, your job's gone. Everything's gone. The only way out, if you got caught," he didn't know how to put it, he said, "Look, well, a lot of them committed suicide." And that was true. He told me about this man that came into him in the cathedral, said he was gay, his family was against him. The next day, he said, "I picked up the newspaper and I read that he'd hanged himself." So anyway, from the period of 1978 to to 1995. I was a history master in a comprehensive school in North Nottinghamshire. And I taught, as I was taught in the 1950s. Yes, it was. I hid behind the mask of Mr. Chips. It was too strict. I was too formal, too unwilling to modernise, because there was these progressive methods that were coming into education, and I couldn't cope with those when they arrived in the 1980s. But inside, as usual, I was a frightened homosexual trying to look like a confident heterosexual on the outside. It had to look like a teacher, easily fitting in with pupils and staff. For about 17 years, for the most part, Mr. Annable succeeded in dodging disapproval. And he maintained a mask of po-faced respectability, hiding inside my little bungalow in an ultra-conservative colliery village in northeast Derbyshire. Po-faced respectability. Like most isolated, closeted gay men, I spoke very little about myself and was constantly on guard. It became a way of life. You couldn't give yourself away. From time to time, I suffered alarming incidents at school. Our staff room was predominantly macho male, a hotbed of football fanaticism, strong language, laddish, crude humour. One afternoon, a colleague lazily leaned back in his seat and yawned out. "Oh, well, nothing much to do. I suppose we could go out and beat up a queer." Probably disappointed at the lack of response, he repeated the bait several times during the following few weeks. Others took notice. One of them came to give me some advice. "You know, Narvel," he says, "you really should make more effort to socialise. Try to fit in. Come to the pub with us once in a while." Well, I told you I didn't drink. But at that point he lowered his voice and he said, "Get yourself a girlfriend. Better still, get yourself married. Talk about the girlfriend. Talk about your wife. I'll tell you, if the boss realised that you were queer, he'd have you out of here so fast your feet wouldn't touch the ground." The final 2 years saw gay hate terminating a teaching career. Although my private life continued to be very private, some pupils began to speculate about my sexuality. A steady, torturous drip destroyed my credibility and confidence. At the edge of a breakdown, another one, a shell of my former self, there came a point when my position was, well, it was untenable. Unable to discharge professional duties, these appalling attacks were never taken seriously by senior management. On Thursday, April the 6th, 1995, a colleague commented on my continuing melancholy, appearance and exhaustion. She came up to me, took a look at me, and she says, "Oh, Narvel, you look dreadful." Absolutely. She says, "You can't go on like this." She said, "Look, take a few days off." You know what? That was almost like a tremendous release. I walked out of that classroom on that day, and I never came back. So there you have it, the car crash. Amongst the gay community, I'm not 100% popular because of all the letters I write and all the rest of it, and rocking the boat, as some of them think. Some people are quite frightened of me. "Why do you keep going on about it?" they say. Well, I'll tell you why. I keep going on about it because 63 years ago an old man taught me out of killing myself.
Nay, lad, a dead lad can do nowt. A live lad, he can do summat.
So here I am today, doing something. Thank you.
Thank you, Narvel. There's not much more I can say to that, apart from thank you for your history and your support in changing our future. Both Narvel and his partner Terry, despite heading towards their 80th decade, are still fighting, and the fight goes on. Thank you.